Hey everyone, welcome to the new episode of the RPG Framework tutorial series. Today we are starting with implementing archery feature into our framework. We're going to build a complete, fully featured archery system from scratch that integrates with Unreal's gameplay ability system and motion matching. Additionally, it will be integrated with all systems we created before, like inventory, weapons and character abilities. In today's video, we're starting with the basics, equipping the bow. We'll set up the bow weapon, attach it to our character, and configure the animation system to handle locomotion while the bow is equipped. But that's just the beginning. During this series of archery tutorials we are going to implement more things like aiming with precision using aim offsets and motion matching, adding a charged shot mechanic that controls power and range based on how long you hold the draw, implementing advanced damage calculation using gameplay ability system, building AI-controlled archers, and more. By the end, you'll have a flexible and scalable archery system for your game. So if you're building a third-person action game or anything with ranged combat in Unreal Engine 5, you're in the right place. First, open your Visual Studio project. Locate the RPG character header file. Find the ability slot enum and add a new value that will represent the ranged ability. Additionally, update the weapon slot enum by adding a new member for the ranged weapon. Next, find the protected section. Here, we need to define a new method for equipping a ranged weapon. You can simply copy the method signature from the equip left-hand weapon method, just rename it to equip ranged weapon. Let's move on to implementing this method. First, ensure that both the ability system component and the provided weapon are valid. Then, use the function clear ability slot to remove any currently equipped ranged ability. After that, add the weapon's light attack ability to the ranged slot and apply the weapon's granted effects to the character's ability system component. Lastly, update the equip weapon function. All you need to do here is add a case for the ranged weapon slot. That's it. Make sure to save all changes and rebuild the project in Visual Studio before continuing. Once the build is complete, open the Unreal Editor. We'll start by creating the bow weapon actor. First, we need to import the bow static mesh. If you don't have your own model, you can use the one I created with Meshy AI. You can find the download link in the description of this video. I'm going to import it into the same folder where the other weapon meshes are located. To keep the folder structure clean, I'll place the imported material and texture into their appropriate folders as well. Now let's create a new weapon blueprint. Open it and assign the bow static mesh we just imported. It seems that my bow is too big compared to the player character. I'm going to add it to the scene to check this. As you can see, it's quite large in comparison to the player. We can fix this by scaling down the bow mesh. I've found that setting the scale to 0.7 works well for me. Let's move forward by setting the RPG item properties, which will help integrate this weapon with our inventory system. Additionally, I'm going to create a new tag that will be used to mark ranged weapons. At the end, you can also add some metadata properties if you wish. Now let's play the game and pick up this bow. After you pick it up, open the equipment menu. If you click on the right-hand weapon slot, you should be able to see the bow. In my case, there's no bow image since I didn't set an icon for this bow yet, but the description and title are correct. If you click on the left-hand button, you'll notice the bow appears there as well. It may be that you want this behavior, but in this tutorial, I'm going to create a separate slot that will only hold ranged weapons. Go to the inventory folder and find the equipment menu widget. Open it. I'm going to add a new slot button by duplicating the right-hand slot button. You can place it wherever you like. I'm going to place it below the right-hand slot and add some space between them. Click on the ranged slot button. In the details panel, you need to change the equipment slot value to the ranged slot. This will ensure that equipping this slot changes the ranged weapon. Now open the event graph. Find the event on initialized. We need to update it by adding the ranged button as shown in the video. Next, find the event on gear button clicked. Locate the place where we are setting tags for the items grid widget. You should notice that a case for the ranged slot is already added. However, we need to make some updates to these queries. Open the first query and rename it to Melee Weapons. In the second expression, add the ranged weapon tag. This will ensure that all weapons tagged with this are excluded from the list of available weapons when selecting the right-hand slot. Repeat this for the left-hand slot as well. For the ranged slot, you need to create a new tag query that will filter only ranged weapons. Now find the event on item equipped. Here, we also need to call the update method for the ranged button. Let's run the game now and test the equipment menu. As you can see, the new slot for ranged weapons appears. Currently, it is empty. Let's click on it and equip the bow. You can see that the bow is attached to our player. However, it is currently attached to the root bone. This is because we haven't configured the bow sockets yet. Let's fix this now. Find and open the skeleton asset used by your player character. Locate the left-hand bone and add a bow socket to it. Make sure to copy the socket name and paste it into the armed socket name property in the bow blueprint. Now configure the socket's location and rotation using the bow mesh as a preview. Once you finish setting up this socket, add another one on the spine 04 bone. This socket will be used as the unarmed bow socket. Again, make sure to copy the exact socket name and paste it into the unarmed socket name property in the bow blueprint. As before, configure the socket's location and rotation using the bow mesh as the preview. When you're done with the socket setup, run the game and validate the bow's position. Let's add animations now. We're going to use the Longbow Animations pack from Mixamo. After you download the animations, make sure to follow the same steps to fix these animations in Blender as we did for the sword and shield animations. You can find detailed instructions on how to do this in the description of this video. Once you finish your work in Blender, import the animations into Unreal Engine. After the import is complete, make sure to rename all animations using the Batch Rename tool. Add the bow prefix to make these animations easier to recognize later. Next, we need to retarget these animations to the Fortnite mannequin. Once the retargeting is done, I'm going to split the bow and arrow animations into a separate folder structure, just like we did for the sword and shield animations before, to keep everything consistent. Now make sure to set up all animations as shown in the video. All animations should have root motion and force root lock enabled. Additionally, all animations, except those for walk and run start, should have the loop property enabled. Let's continue by creating pose search databases for the bow and arrow animations. Create a new pose search database. For the schema, select the default schema. Name it PSD_bow and arrow_ idles. Then duplicate it for all other states. In the end, you should have 5 databases, as shown in the video. Let's start by populating the idle animations. For the sake of simplicity in this tutorial, I'm going to use only one idle animation. Repeat this process for all the other databases. For the run animations, you can omit the turn stop animation from the database. It's enough to include animations for movement in all 4 directions. Once you've finished setting up the pose search databases, you'll need to create a new chooser table for handling bow states. The simplest way to do this is by duplicating the existing chooser table used for the sword and shield states. Now configure the chooser table as shown in the video. Once you're done configuring the chooser table for the bow and arrow animations, move forward by creating a new chooser table for handling ranged combat animations. A separate chooser for ranged combat will allow you to easily add more ranged weapons with different animations later, making the system highly scalable. Again, you don't need to start from scratch. Create a new chooser table by duplicating the one used for armed states. You can delete the second row and replace the assets in the other 2 rows with the bow chooser table. Additionally, delete one column. We're going to use the weapon class enum, but not the ones related to the left or right hand. Instead, we'll introduce a new one. Open the Sandbox Character Animation Blueprint. Find the function Update Essential Values. Go to the end of this function and store the weapon class of the equipped ranged weapon into a new variable. Additionally, we need to add new value for the bow and weapon class enum. Now go back to the Ranged Chooser table and bind the ranged weapon class to the enum column we already have. Configure it as shown in the video. The last thing we are going to cover in this tutorial is attaching the bow to the left arm socket we created earlier. When this happens, we should also switch the animations to use those for the bow and arrow states. To keep this solution clean and maintainable, we are going to create a new blueprint interface that will contain definitions for Archer-related functionalities. For now, we need to define two functions: draw ranged weapons and return ranged weapons. Next, let's implement this interface in the character base blueprint. Again, to keep this blueprint organized, I'm going to put all archery-related events into a separate graph. Let's start by implementing the Draw Ranged Weapons function. This function is similar to the one we created for attaching melee weapons to the armed sockets. So I'm going to copy its implementation. However, we need to make some modifications. Here, we don't need to iterate through all equipped weapons, we only need the one equipped in the ranged slot. Additionally, we need to call the function to return all melee weapons, in case we are drawing the bow while melee weapons are still equipped. At the end, we should introduce a new Boolean variable that will indicate whether the character is in ranged combat. When you compile this blueprint, you may encounter a warning message about a deprecated pin after upgrading to Unreal Engine 5.5. To fix this, simply refresh the problematic node, and the warning will disappear. Now let's implement the function for returning the ranged weapon to the unarmed socket. We should follow the same principle as in the previous function. This time, we need to check if the character is in ranged combat and then search for the unarmed weapon socket. At the end of the function, the character should exit the ranged combat state by setting the ranged combat variable to false. In addition to these changes, we will also need to update the methods for attaching melee weapons. Find the Draw Weapons function. At the beginning of this function, we need to ensure that the ranged weapons are returned. Additionally, we need to update the functions responsible for attaching weapons to armed and unarmed sockets, so that they skip the ranged weapon slot. The last thing we need to do is notify motion matching that the character has entered ranged combat, so that the animations can be switched accordingly. To do this, go to the Sandbox Character Animation Blueprint. Be sure to save the ranged combat value to a new variable. Additionally, we will need to cache the value from the previous frame. This is necessary to explicitly inform the motion matching system to switch to the ranged combat databases immediately when a ranged weapon is equipped. To do this, go to the anim graph and find the motion matching node. Open the function related to onUpdate. Here you will find another function that we need to update. This is the function for getting interrupt mode. Open it. We need to add one more pin to the final OR statement. We should simply check if a ranged weapon is equipped during this frame, using the variables we just created. One last thing we need to do before testing this is to add the range chooser to the main chooser table. Now everything is ready. To be able to test this, I'm going to assign some debug keys for drawing and returning the ranged weapon in the player blueprint. Let's start the game now and test it. As you can see, when you equip the bow, the new animations are played. When you return it, the unarmed locomotion animations are played, just like we wanted. And that wraps up today's tutorial. We've successfully set up the bow as a new weapon type, integrated it into the equipment system, configured sockets and animations, and made sure the character properly switches between melee and ranged combat states. Next time we will add aiming state. If you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss upcoming episodes in this series. Also, check the video description for useful links, including project files and resources like the bow model I used. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Thanks for watching and see you in the next tutorial.